I am TV journalist, and today I am a moderator of these debates. So the Fund of Democratic Initiatives conduct roundtables on different topics, and I am glad that I am a part of this team. So today's topic for debate is the future of Crimea. Is reintegration possible? When and how? Today, together with experts, we are going to work on the main messages and the main address to the media, to the community and politicians. And now I would like to announce the agenda of our meeting. We have main speakers. I'm going to present them to you. Each speaker will have 5 minutes to present his or her position on the topic of today's discussion. And also we will, Ruslan Kermach will start our discussion. He will present the main information that was worked on, and we will start the discussion based on the data. And I have also we have simultaneous translation here. That's why I ask the speakers to speak slowly. To speak slowly, as I am saying now, in order that translators could translate you simultaneously into English. So I want to present today's speakers. So the topic is the future of Crimea. Is reintegration possible? When and how? Today's speakers are Yulia Tyschenko, expert of civil society, Center for Independent Political Research, Refat Chubarov, head of Mejlis, Yuriy Smilyanskyi, Mykhailo Samus. Also, we have Yusuf Kurkchi, first deputy on the matters of temporarily occupied territories and IDPs. He is in this hall. We greet him. And also we have Andriy Kymenko, senior editor of BlackSeaNews portal. Alexei Garany, founder of Democratic Initiative, professor of Kiev Mogila Academy, as I said, Ruslan Kermach. And also we wait for Pavlo Kazarin. He is the journalist Crimea.Reality. I don't see him in this hall now. So the Fund of Democratic Initiatives and Center named after Razumkov carried out survey as to the future of Crimea, and I would like to tell you that starting from 11th till 16th of 2016, 2016 people were surveyed, and there was a massive of information, and this information will be presented to your attention, and after this we will start our debates. And now I give the floor to Ruslan, please. You are given the floor. Thank you. Firstly, from the Fund of Democratic Initiatives, I would like to thank everyone and our esteemed speakers, journalists, dear guests, who joined our public debates that are named The Future of Crimea. Is reintegration possible? When and how? Before presenting social analytic data, I will make some introduction. The problems of Crimea is present in the media, and different formats are provided to present this program. Debates are conducted, but I believe that we should carry out with those debates. And at the moment in Crimea, there is no military actions like in Donbass, but at the same time we see that this is a different level of discussion. We should understand that Ukrainian citizens live there, Crimean Tatars live there, who live in under permanent pressure and persecutions from the occupation forces and law enforcement structures. Also, authoritarian regime is established, and that's why we shouldn't lose Crimea from the radius of our attention, and we should constantly discuss these important issues. Today's event is aimed for this goal, and by my small address, I would like to focus on such important component that was lacking during previous debates that I took part in as a participant, and it is important while developing the strategy of the occupation and reintegration of Crimea to Ukraine. And this is important component, that is the component of public opinion. We should understand how population of Ukraine see this problem of Crimea and what Ukrainian citizens think about it, and whether they want the return of Crimea, whether they believe that this is possible, and in what way should the state return this peninsula, and what is the status of this peninsula after it will be returned to Ukraine. So all these issues are relevant in the context of developing the strategy. If we are speaking about state strategy of long-term character, that is for the long period of time of its implementation. And of course, we shouldn't only rely on public opinion in this important issue, because we understand that the citizens cannot understand all the context elements, they cannot assess all the risks of one or another strategic approach to reintegration. And this is an important and complex issue. And there should be a basis for this research quality, examination of the case. Shareholders should be involved, and they should assess and create an appropriate scenario. In any case, we should understand that in our key directions, the strategy should be harmonized with the wish of people of Ukraine. In such case, this strategy will be legitimate and prospects to be implemented effectively in the long-term perspective, in spite of the changes in the government. That's why our foundation, in the framework of the survey that was conducted in May this year, wanted to know the opinion of the citizens of Ukraine about the fundamental issues concerning the future of Crimea and the view of Ukrainian citizens on the future of Crimea. Citizens of Ukraine see the future of Crimea with a moderate optimism. The majority of the citizens, and I ask to show the infographics on the screen, people should see the information so that people could follow. The majority of the citizens, 69%, believe that Crimea should be a part of Ukraine. Only 12 believe that it should be independent, and 7 believe that the Crimea should belong to Russia. And 54% of Ukrainians believe that the return of Crimea to Ukrainian jurisdiction is reality and is really possible. And the majority of residents of Western and Central macro regions believe so, and in Donbas and the East, the majority also present, but only relevant majority. You may see it from 40% in the East and 45% in Donbas. So if we go out from this information, and is reintegration possible? Yes. This survey shows that reintegration is possible, that there are some contradictions that show up in the second part of the question. How and when this integration is possible? What are the conditions? What are preconditions for this? So among those who believe that it is possible to return Crimea, they believe that it can be only in a long-term perspective. This is 35%, not in the nearest future. And the experts that were surveyed in the framework of the separate survey, that you can find this information in the annexes of this research. In the framework of this survey, the experts didn't present single opinion when this will happen, this reintegration of Crimea. But they believe that this is possible in the mid-term perspective, 4 or 5 years, or in long-term perspective, 6 or more years. 39% of those who were surveyed believe that we need to promote the issue about return of Crimea, and 31% of surveyed believe that this issue is important, but this is not an acute issue for today. So, and others believe that we should not start to discuss this issue now. And about the conditions to return Crimea, so expectations among those who believe that it can be returned, the majority is for the reforms to increase the level of well-being, 35%. Also important preconditions to restore Ukrainian authority in Crimea. The Ukrainian citizens believe this is the strengthening of sanctions and pressure on the Russian Federation from the side of international community, and also change of power of president in the Russian Federation. Also, the experts that were surveyed by us in the framework of our research, they also mentioned these 3 key priorities: reforms, strengthening of sanctions, and the change of power. And not mandatory, 47% of citizens of Ukraine, they believe that this issue about the future status of reintegrated Crimea, that this should not be brought to the all-Ukrainian referendum. So it is whether it should be resolved at all-Ukrainian referendum, or it should be autonomous republic like before occupation, or it should be deprived of the status, or it should be Tatar, Crimean Tatar autonomy. So the public opinion shows that this issue should be resolved by the residents of Crimea themselves. Also, among the public, there is no single opinion about financial support of Crimea after its return to the territory of Ukraine. So we know that Crimea, before occupation, that was in 2014, it was not financially self-sufficient region. There were some benefits, and they provided some financial support for Crimea before occupation. So 41% of those who were surveyed, they are ready to support Crimea financially, and 43 believe that Crimea should be self-supporting without Kiev. So, on the whole, we may say that Ukrainian citizens do not doubt the return of Crimea. They believe that this is the territory of Ukraine, but there are some regional differences that you can see in the graphics about how this position is expressed, and also citizens believe that Crimea can be deoccupied and returned to Ukraine in a short-term perspective, but many believe that this can be possible only in a long-term perspective. But they differ in their opinion about acuteness of this issue and its strategic vision in what way the Crimea should be returned to Ukraine. That's why we need to develop a strategy. We discussed a lot at the level of state. It should be a complex, comprehensive strategy to deoccupy Crimean Peninsula, and I hope that our colleagues that are invited here today will assess this opinion, and maybe they will tell their views about strategic prospects and whether it is realistic to implement the strategy and to show the public the key messages of the strategy. So Ruslan presented brief information about sociological survey. You have such leaflets, so you may consider these figures because they are very interesting. The strategy of returning of Crimea should correlate. I will try to speak slowly. The strategy of returning the Crimea should be harmonized with the views of Ukraine about return of Crimea, and the figures that we heard today, they are optimistic. And I would like to address our main speakers, and I would like to remind that they have 5 minutes each to represent their views. What is your attitude towards this research? Do you have some optimism towards this research? So maybe we will ask Yulia to start. So, Yulia Tyschenko, expert on civil society development programs, Ukrainian Center for Independent Political Research.
Well, I manage other programs, but in general, I'm very thankful to Democratic Initiatives Foundations for this event and to our citizens who provided assessments and the interpretations, how they see Crimea now. As for me, the main question is which Crimea should be in accordance with this perception. We should elaborate our strategy. This response to the question, what should it look like, what Crimea should look like, this should be the basis underlying strategy development. The policy of the occupation is inside among the questions which were in the survey of experts survey whether Crimea should be in a part of Russia or a part of Ukraine or just independent. The difference is either to be the gray zone like Abkhazia, Ossetia, or just independent state, because in contrast to those unrecognized territories, Crimea is annexed illegally by Russia, and all consequences ensuing in all sectors, in ethical, ethnic, and educational practices. These practices are concentrated and implemented and concern human rights and inter-ethnic relationships and different humanitarian and educational policies. As for me, of course, Crimea will return to Ukraine, but what will be the method, I don't know. This conflict or this war between Ukraine and Russia, it's better not to become a global conflict. It would be a good solution to resolve the situation first in Crimea and after that in Donbass. There are many factors for this assumption. there is such hypothesis that Ukraine will be reforming and everyone will be willing to be a part of Ukraine, so all the population of Crimea will become to return to Ukraine. I don't think it would be so. I think that in Georgia situation is much better than in Abkhazia. Otherwise, Abkhazia's populations can't change the situation in order to reintegrate Abkhazia with Georgia. So forming the policy of reintegration and deoccupation, we should take account of all relevant details concerning with the domestic situation in RF and its relations with Western countries and vectors of Russian Federation development which are in place now. Russian Federation itself believe it is a great empire and it has enough time not to be in a haste. So elites do not make statements about Crimea. Taking into account in the strategy the opinion of Ukrainian population, yes, it should take place, but also those citizens who cannot be surveyed, their opinions should be also integrated into the survey. But those citizens, they are living now in the occupied and annexed territory. If they respond to the survey, they even may experience a threat to their freedom and life. There are some data that during that self-proclaimed referendum, the data was quite different to that claimed by Russia. What concerns our vision of potential vision of Crimea, I think today we should raise issues and questions that Crimea should be an autonomy of Crimean Tatar people. But we should not only declare this, we should conduct a wide political discussion so that we can discuss what ethnic and language groups may be included in such an independent autonomy. And the discussions mostly focus some fears. What will some person in Crimea say, or what would some Western ethnic minorities in Ukraine would be thinking, what is their opinion. So talking today about strategy of the occupation and reintegration of Crimea is an urgent matter, but in parallel we should build capacity of our governmental structure, not only the ministry which has been just created and it has not started in full its operations. The whole vertical should be established so that we know who is responsible of officials for example, management of state-owned property in agricultural sector and what should be done with in this sector. Who can tell us the full list of Ukrainian cultural heritage facilities which remain in occupied Crimea? There are no such lists, full list at least. During 2 years, the whole range of matters remains unresolved. So the rhetorics is available like Crimea will return, and in political discourse these phrases are relevant, but this is not insufficient for all other aspects besides politics. It should become a priority in more wide scenes than only political scene. For our citizens, we should generate messages which they can share. Of course, some military approaches to returning Crimea are possible, but the military way is not perceived, is not accepted in our society. All opportunities the matter of militarization of Crimea is very important because it is turning into a military base where our unloyal citizens, why should we invest in development of this military base of foreign country? We should have consolidated messages to outside Ukraine, not only for our citizens. International policy and world's conjuncture, they also have influence on developments and on scenarios. Otherwise, package reintegration or non-package reintegration, they have not been created. Different statements mention them, but international subjects of responsibility, they are not in place in scenarios. So not everything depends on citizens which are on occupied territories. Ukraine should articulate messages not only as rhetorics, but messages for domestic population and messages for foreigners, for other countries. And as concern genocide and Crimean Tatar ethnic question. Thank you for this discussion, for today's debates. They will help us to generate our vision of movement towards reintegration of Crimea. Thank you, Ms. Yulia. There are more questions than answers in your speech. The first thesis is we are talking first about the occupation, and then the second matter will be reintegration. Let's not forget the thesis. I don't have some contrasting versions, but there is one version when Crimea is in the independent territory, kind of independent country. We included it. It is similar to the question included in similar survey in Levada Center, but I agree, Ms. Yulia, that these contextual moments such as unrecognized independent state or recognized, yes, sociological surveys, they should include this feature. But thank you. This survey was conducted in May, and on May 18, when we had the Day of Memory of Crimean Tatar deportation, our president declared that we should have Crimean Tatar autonomy inside our state. I would like to give the word to the chief editor of BlackSeaNews, Andriy Kymenko. Against the background of developments in Crimea, which intensify, I think that I should I should say that I should introduce myself as a prisoner, Andriy Kymenko, who will be punished in Crimea for separatism according to the relevant article of the Russian Federation Criminal Code. I have one very good thesis and this question to Ms. Bekeshkina and my colleagues from Razunkov Center 1 month before in March, thanks to Maidan of Foreign Affairs, SOS performed a survey including for Crimea and the figures and trends in regional aspect and regional also sector. The figures coincide almost. So we understand that we can be more surely talking about general trends in the region, that the trends coincide. This is important. As far as I remember, the foundation, Democratic Initiatives Foundation, conducted analogous survey in January. The situation deteriorated, and the optimism among Ukrainians during a year and a half fell down. The figures I'm going to talk about, I think they are consequence of the lacking integrated policy. It is a fragmented policy in different ministries in Ukraine, not just some imitations which Crimeans are irritated about. About myths, when there is no state policy but there are only actions of civil society activists and NGOs and other countries who do not support the annexation and they introduce sanctions, when there is vacuum, it is filled with some messages. With myths. The myth is that the welfare in Ukraine, well-being in Ukraine will be better in Ukraine than in Russia, and then Crimean people will be willing to return to Ukraine. Well, it is impossible, I think, that they will go back themselves in the country which occupied and annexed Crimea. That country is not democratic and it does not include take account of public opinions in their regime. This is not about comparison of economic potentials. We are talking here about the framework of the whole world. Geopolitical framework has broken. This is an event of global and pan-European importance. Second thing, due to this vacuum, most of respondents say that Crimean citizens themselves should decide on Crimean identity and which country it wants to be a part of. For half in the year, we have been tracing the demographic process. In 3 or 4 years, according to my assessments, about 1 million people from Russia will remove from other parts of Russian Federation to Crimea. Now we have 100,000 citizens of Russian Federation who has already moved for permanent residence to Sebastopol. 100,000. They are registered. They came to Sebastopol from other regions of Russian Federation. Crimea is fivefold by number of population. So hundreds of thousands of Russian Federation citizens they move from other parts of Russian Federation not only to Sebastopol but also to other parts of Crimea. This means replacement of Crimean Tatars, Ukrainians, and all other ethnic groups. The other myth about Crimea that it was not financially self-sufficient region in Ukraine. Crimea, before the war, collected the proceeds to the national budget about $1 billion or $1.5 billion. Half of those budget proceeds went to Kiev, and the same portion returned from Kiev to the Crimea. So all regions were like that in Ukraine. So I would like to ask my colleagues not to focus on this topic too much because it is very difficult topic. There are very many myths now. The first myth is that Crimeans themselves wanted that. 1/3 of Crimean population was pro-Russian, and 2/3 that were for Ukraine. It was Razumkov Center's surveys which demonstrated that. And the security service also conducted such survey, traced the trends, and the results were the same. That was only 1/3 of population which were for Russia, but not for Ukraine. And then Mustafa Dzhemilev and Russian advocacy groups, they say that that 1/3 they really went and voted at that referendum, and the other 2/3 they just didn't go to that referendum. And the main thing is how to count the results of the referendum. And there is also 1/3 of Ukrainians, of whom 60% are Crimean Tatars. So, of course, all these things, they are interconnected. The Russians try to displace Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars, and they turned the flow of Russians from cold regions who buy houses by packages, the whole packages of houses in Crimea. About this topic, which is saying that this is not important now, where 31% of Soviet responses said that Crimean integration is not the issue to be resolved now. Those first-year children who started their school days this year, if we tell that this is not a good time to return Crimea, Russian school, while we were talking that this is bad time to return Crimea, during those periods for 5 or 6 years, this first year school boy will turn into such a separatist, militant, military man, serving to the Russian Federation. In our state, our officials should stop demonstrating that they do not know what to do. The strategies should be published. They have already been commented and published by experts in June 2014. During that time, maybe a ton of paper have been used for commenting the strategies when experts said what should be done. 2 years have passed till in our state. This is the time which is required usually to our state. We were talking about the ministry. The ministry is in the process of formation as a central executive agency. Those people who address the matter of Crimea, we very clearly understand what to do, and we are doing, and we ask our friends from foreign countries what to do. We recommend them and they act. We should break the trend when 50% of Ukraine think that this is untimely, and only half of Ukrainians are optimistic about reintegration of Crimea. We should go to the region and talk to people and conduct public awareness campaign, because then we now receive the same situation as with Novorossiya, New Russian. This is Putin's project, Novorossiya, New Russia. So we should go jointly and take joint efforts. Thank you, Mr. Andriy. Thank you for your reflection on this sociological survey data. We have heard emotional narration, what is happening in Crimea, how many patriots we have in Crimea, what are their wishes. And experts in 2014 has already presented the vision, and now we have 2016. So we have summarized this topic, and I'm giving the floor to Mr. Smilyanskyi. What do you think about today's figures and meetings?
So I'm one of those people of 2016 people who were surveyed. It happened so that from all the options that were proposed as answers, I didn't find I wanted to answer and say that this is like this. So I wrote a separate answer of my own to each of the questions proposed. So I didn't agree with the argument that there is no military actions in Crimea, what is going on in the east of Ukraine. Military actions are not only a fact of some artillery, subversive group activities, and other things. Fighting against population is the element of military actions, and we see it in Crimea everywhere. And these military actions, in the form they are carried out in Crimea, they are carried out in the process of colonization of the territory of the occupied Crimea that is carried out by Russian Federation. And the examples were delivered by Andriy. This is replacement of population, militarization, and other factors. So what this survey shows? Firstly, my opinion on this research. This is the level of understanding of future of the country, and people reflect their political views on this survey. And this position is formed without formulated state policy in concerning these issues. So the figures that were presented, they are rather optimistic. I repeat what my colleagues said. Reintegration cannot be done without deoccupation. But the basis for reintegration should be made. We had to start it years ago, but we hope for parliamentary hearings, and they will lay some grounds for deoccupation and reintegration, and the deputies will vote for this, and this processes will start. So the issue of the status of the Crimea. Firstly, to speak about referendum, we should base it on principle of justice. Before the first annexation of the territory of Crimea, this was a separate state. And then the occupation before occupation, right? In Soviet times, it was Tatar Soviet Republic during the Second World War. And after the occupation of Crimea, there was an oblast created, and the main reason to turn it into oblast, because there was deportation, and after this deportation, they also deported not only Tatars, but also Greeks and other nationalities, and each person in his life wants to be treated fairly. And fairness and justice, each person has different attitude towards it, but if we build a state of European type, so the values that underlie the state, they should be common for all of us. And the rights that reflect the will of people for self-identification. So the Crimea should be re-established as the Tatar separate unit. So this issue should be brought to discussion and to explain to people that this is important. And the mechanism was, Andriy told us about the mechanism. We should meet with people and explain to people these issues, and the state should formulate the policy, and together with civil society, the state should develop these processes further. And also, one more thing about financing. You know, in my opinion, the task of the power not to distribute money or other benefits to support the territories in the country. The task of the power is to create social economic conditions for the development of each region in order that each region could reach its financial self-sufficiency, both in taxation and also budget capabilities, and that it could take part in the benefits that can be made only at the level of the state. So from this point on, it is the creation of economic model in the country that can be spread to the occupied territories, and Andriy told us about it. He proposed some figures that before the war we had only 5 regions that were in good position concerning taxation. So should we discuss the opportunities of all the regions that have self-sufficiency concerning taxation? So do you want to provide some benefits to such regions? No, this is a complex topic, and this leads to the ruining of the country. So these were painful points of discussion. And so Crimea is militarized, and Crimea should be in the status of Crimean Tatar Republic, and so we will discuss state policy further, and we will ask Refat Chubarov and the deputy of the minister. But now I give the floor to Mykhailo Samus, deputy director of the International Affairs Center for Research on Army Conversion and Disarmament. So thank you for this wonderful opportunity to speak about Crimea and to raise this question in the international media environment. And this is one of the main tasks and goals of our activity. As to the survey, I won't say much, but I would like to say that it is rather optimistic result, and I would like to provide information about some of our research and the opportunities for the occupation of Crimea and reintegration. Reintegration, you know that Crimea is turned into a big military base, and the issue of reintegration of the military base of Russia into Ukraine, it's rather weird. So we should speak about de-occupation. So firstly, we do not have conditions for de-occupation. Russian Federation, I won't tell you about time, I tell you about the facts. Russia also did not exhaust its potential for further occupation of Ukrainian territory. For example, coastline area of Ukraine, Russia can easily block the sea area, and Ukrainian military marine forces, they cannot prevent this. This is one problem. The other is comprehensive safety problems. Russia concentrated forces in all directions, starting from creating of the first army, tank army, and also strengthening of the units in Belarus. The situation there can change dramatically, and in some instances they will bring Russian forces there maybe. And also in Moldova there will be presidential elections, and according to our estimates there is high probability that there will be a pro-Russian candidate, and in Moldova can become a federal state supported by Russia, and there can be uncontrolled accumulation of Russian military contingent. So we see increasing military capabilities of Russia around Ukraine, and the Russian fleet, I'm not speaking about Ukrainian forces that are developing now, but marine forces, they are not in condition that they need to be. 2 years passed after Crimea was occupied, and they destroyed infrastructure of Ukrainian Marines in Crimea, and these forces were not transformed into the powerful structure that could help us to prevent Russian occupation. So we should freeze Corvette project. This is not for this time. It will just eat all the budget, and it prevent the development of marine forces. We should create a small and powerful fleet that could urgently react, and it should show Russia that they cannot. So these should be missile platforms, maybe some ships that have anti-vessel missiles with a complex system of reconnaissance that can return fire, and that are not. This will be a symmetric response to those challenges when Russian Federation turned Crimea into military base, and it threatens not only Ukraine but also Europe, because they have also nuclear capabilities, and we shouldn't forget about it. About the occupation, what we should do. I told you about the threats that are today, but there are some forecasts about the occupation. We believe that our center believes that the occupation is not possible without changing in the strategic balance. There is weak Ukraine, weak Europe, and the weak United States, and there are no motives why Russia should turn Crimea back to Ukraine, because we know that Putin really was ready to risk when he occupied Crimea. So only changes in global changes can lead to the occupation of Crimea. What should be done? We will speak about Ukraine, not about Europe and United States. We believe that there are several options. Firstly, Ukraine joins NATO, and it will change strategic balance in the region. And it will raise the issue of Crimea at a different level and force Russia to have different attitude towards this issue and towards Ukraine. Is it real? Ukraine now adopted strategic defense bulletin and starts to prepare to enter NATO. The second is political will of our partners in NATO, France and Germany. This is the issue of different character. Other option is the creation of strategic non-nuclear deterrence to force Russia to think about whether it is worthwhile to make warfare with Ukraine at all the front. I mean, these are missiles that have range of that can threaten critical goals in the territory of Russian Federation, combined with the special forces and complex reconnaissance activities. So Russian Federation forces, they should be constantly under threat from our conventional weapons. Also, there should be strategic nuclear capabilities. So this issue, it is at the level of radicalism and populism, but if we remember that by occupying Crimea, Russian Federation destroyed the basis of the system of control over proliferation of nuclear weapons and ruined Budapest Memorandum, and by hands of our Western allies, including the United States, the system was fully destroyed. The system of non-proliferation of nuclear weapons was destroyed. We can find out the situation when there will be urgent issue for Ukraine to get nuclear weapons in order to preserve sovereignty and independence and territorial integrity. I explain why. We see the attitude of European Union and NATO, and also I remember about France and Germany that tried by any way, through different means, visa liberalization, or they try to keep Ukraine out of Europe, to have this iron curtain. And when there will be nuclear chaos in the world, and you know that Russia and Ukraine can create missiles of different ranges and can think about obtaining nuclear weapons. So this option should be discussed openly, and our Western partners should understand this and take part in this discussion. We should explain to them that Ukraine is a subject of international law that tries to keep its independence, and obtaining nuclear weapons, it's not populism or any other instrument of blackmail. It is just for survival when Budapest Memorandum was ruined. And in the West, they say the Budapest Memorandum is just a piece of paper. We should just read it once again. There are signatures not by Zakharchenko and Plotnitsky. There are the signatures of the leaders of leading countries of the world, the President of the United States, for example. So we cannot call it just a piece of paper. This is a document. I believe that this document has the right to be addressed to, and we should review this memorandum, and we should say that Ukraine have the right to get nuclear capabilities in order to prevent occupation from the side of Russian Federation. If we realize the options that I named, there can be military and strategic conditions to raise the issue of the occupation of Crimea. This is a difficult strategic issue, and in this respect, the systematic and strategic conceptual work of the state should be a key aspect in this process, because we cannot deoccupy and reintegrate Crimea without systemic work at each level, starting from international and to the grassroots level. Through lectures in the regions, we won't solve this issue. Thank you. Mikhail, I thank you, and I want to tell we were joined by Pavlo Kazarin, journalist, TV host, observer of Krym.Reality. So we heard about military and strategic process